Chris Saltmarsh is, well, he's a friend of Bright Green. He's been a long-standing contributor to Bright Green, used to write a fortnightly column and still occasionally contributes, which is brilliant. He's also the co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal and the author of this book here, Burnt Fighting for Climate Justice, which you can get a copy of at all good retailers, I am sure. And Chris is going to be talking to us today about the Labour Party's climate policies and what Labour for a Green New Deal are pushing for them to be. Before we get onto that, Chris, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. I'm doing great, thanks.
Good, good, good. Brilliant to have you. So let's get straight to it. So at the Labour Party conference, Ed Miliband said the next Labour government will make the UK the first country to achieve zero carbon power by 2030. And the conference itself was branded brighter, greener future or something. It was the
Fairer,
whole
greener
shebang
future.
was fairer, greener future. I was adding the bright green tinge to it there.
They've not quite stolen
The
your
whole
branding this
Not yet.
time.
The whole thing was kind of pitched as being, Labour pushing on the climate crisis. And obviously, one of the big announcements that came out of Labour conference was Keir Starmer saying the next Labour government would set up a publicly owned renewable energy company. So, do you think this is a sign of Labour moving in the right direction on the climate?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my takeaway is that there is a distinction between an improvement, which I think it is, and the right direction. I think it's clearly an improvement because before this Labour Party conference, there was a lot of confusion about what Labour's climate policies were, which bits of the 2019 manifesto they were planning to keep and which bits they were planning to ditch, whether they were taking it in a new direction. I think with this, we have some clarity on not just what the party's ambition is, we also have some clarity on what their kind of overall economic strategy is and how that fits and how climate fits into that. The reason I say I don't think it's quite the right direction is that I think, what Labour for a Green New Deal, what I've been calling for is a socialist approach to climate politics where we're expanding public ownership across the whole economy. I think what Labour laid out at this Labour Party conference was that they would be taking on a distinctly kind of Fabian social democratic approach to the economy, where they're prepared to intervene in markets. Maybe that's with some targeted public ownership or some targeted, state intervention, disciplining of capital, but it's not about transforming the whole economy. And so, when we think about Labour's 2019 manifesto, that had a commitment to be as close to net zero, really, as close to net zero by as close to 2030 as possible. Now the ambition we're seeing is zero carbon power by 2030, but the energy sector is only about 20% of all emissions, and so there's a rowing back there, and obviously it's jarring for me because the kind of intervening few years dealing with a climate crisis, bringing down emissions has only become more urgent. So there's a big gap there in terms of Labour's plans. It leaves out big sectors like transport and agriculture. So even this target of 2030, as well as for power, as well as being inadequate on its own terms, I don't think is particularly substantiated by the plans that Labour's laid out. And I think that brings us to the kind of the relative inadequacy of the pledge of a publicly owned renewable energy company. Now, I think the big gain of this is that it is really good that the party has recognized there must be a role for public ownership in the energy system. I think that's been a big battle we've been fighting. We've been arguing that it's important in order to accelerate the transition, make sure it's fair and rapid. But I think crucially the difference is that this policy of a relatively small public energy company that will have the power to generate some energy, but also invest in private energy capacity, with the aim of becoming the size of a company like EDF eventually, isn't quick enough. It's not enough investment. If we have, say, 6 years to decarbonize all of the energy sector, well, how much of that time is Great British Energy going to spend building itself up to be the size of EDF? I think what we need at the very, very minimum is a public company of the size of EDF to start with, because otherwise it's going to be crowded out of the market. It's not going to do anything to bring down energy prices because it's going to be competing in that market. It's only going to be able to bring so much renewable energy online because it's going to be undercapitalized compared to those other big established companies, and it's not going to be able to scale at pace because it because as I say, it won't have the investment from the state that it needs. So I think this is better than what we were thinking it was going to be like before. I think Labour clearly will have climate policies into the next election. As yet, I'm not convinced that they're good enough by the standards of the climate, which is an objective one rather than a kind of political electoral one.
So, in terms of that vision for climate policy that you've kind of alluded to there, and what you said is the necessity of the objective reality of the climate crisis, you've talked about a socialist Green New Deal as
Mm.
being what you and Labour for Green New Deal are pushing for. What does that look like in practice, and what do you want Labour to adopt as part of that programme?
Yeah, I think when we talk about a socialist Green New Deal, there's a few core elements. One is about the pace of decarbonisation. We're really clear that for kind of both domestically, but also our international obligations, it's really important that we're decarbonising, within a 10-year time frame, but ideally quicker than that. The second pillar of it is about scale of investment. It requires stewarding, much larger amounts of public funds than what we've seen, certainly over the kind of last 10 years of austerity, but also before then as well. I think perhaps most crucially, a socialist Green New Deal is about expanding public ownership across the whole economy. So it's about where there are failing private markets, it's about taking out the profit motive, it's about taking out private competition, and it's about saying the state can provide these basic core strategic utilities so that it can centrally plan and coordinate a transition, make sure it's quick, make sure it's fair. I think the fourth of kind of five pillars of a socialist Green New Deal is about internationalism. It's about making sure that we're not just decarbonizing within the borders of one country. It's about ensuring that we're also financing just transition internationally as well. And finally, I think, and really crucially, it's about trade union power. It's about ensuring that we don't just decarbonize our current political economy, where capital and the rich kind of dominate workers and the poor. It's about fundamentally rebalancing our economy so that we can repeal anti-trade union laws, reinvigorate workers' rights, and ensure that workers are leading on the transition in the campaign for a Green New Deal, both campaigning but also in their workplaces. That's the kind of socialist Green New Deal vision we've sketched out. In terms of what we're demanding currently, I think there's a recognition that where we're at in terms of that economic strategy is not the same as where Keir Starmer's party is at. We clearly come from different ideological positions on that. That's to be expected, although it's frustrating. I think what we're really focusing on is saying within that context of a kind of different political view on how we should run the economy, we do think that full public ownership of the energy system is a basic. So whatever your broader economic principles, the climate crisis really commands that you have a fully publicly owned energy system. And I think where that's a little bit different to what other people have been saying in the past few years is very often there'll be an argument for say, well, we want to bring the big six into public ownership. Those are the kind of supply companies that you and I would deal with on a day-to-day basis. Or there may be a policy around we want to bring the national grid into public ownership. Perversely, the national grid is currently owned by a private company called National Grid. Or it might be some policy around, well, we want cooperative renewable energy production, or we want publicly owned renewable energy generation. These are all viable and I think really important policy positions on different bits of the energy system being publicly owned. But our argument is that the energy system should be a unified whole. It has been fragmented, it has been marketized, it has been privatized and sold off to profiteers. Some elements of the energy system, like transmission, are the most profitable sectors of any sector in the UK economy. But it's a fake market, it's a natural monopoly that has been sold off. And so we're saying what we need to do as a matter of urgency in order for there to be a coordinated and accelerated energy transition is unifying this energy system, bringing it all together so it can be coordinated and planned, but also taken out of the profit motive entirely. There really can be no role for profit in an energy system when we have bills as high as they are and when we have fossil fuels still pumped into the atmosphere. There really is no time to even intervene in markets at this point. It needs to be a total supplanting of markets.
So I've got one more question specifically about the Labour Party and I guess Labour for a Green New Deal's role in it before we move on to some other things and
Mhm.
potentially some questions from the chat and from Twitter. If you do have questions, please do pop them in the chat. We'll try and get as many of them put to Chris as we can. Before we do that, so the kind of approach you've kind of outlined as to what you and Labour for a Green New Deal are pushing for with regards to tackling the climate crisis, decarbonising the energy system, reshaping the economy, and so on. That's quite a distance away from where the Labour Party currently is in terms of its approach on energy policy, on economic policy, and so on. And also, the context in the Labour Party is, you've got a leadership that has, moved substantially to the right, both in terms of, Keir Starmer himself, but then also the people that he's appointed to shadow cabinet positions, to advisory positions and staff position within his office, and so on. You've also got, the purging of left wing members of the Labour Party, either the self purging because people can't stomach being a member of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, or the active purging through the weaponised disciplinary process. And you've got what we've seen in recent weeks, the quite clear rigging of the parliamentary selections process taking place, with left wing candidates being kept off the ballot and the long list and the short list for selections. So, in that context, what's the strategy and how do you organise and agitate for the kind of policy shift that you're looking for when you've got a party that is, I guess, institutionally trying to stop radicalism from within its own ranks at every turn?
Yeah, that's a stark and long list of the kind of anti-democratic measures that the current leadership has very gleefully brought in over the past, I don't know, two and a half years or so. And it's a really challenging. The Labour Party is a really challenging environment to be organising in right now. I guess our perspective as socialists within the Labour Party is that despite that, the Labour Party remains a key terrain of struggle within British politics if we're on the left because for better or worse, and I'm sure many of your viewers will have strong opinions about our electoral system and its flaws within the current political context, the Labour Party is the only viable alternative to the Tory party. And it is likely that the Labour Party will form the next government. And so we believe it is still politically essential to contest the Labour Party. As you say, that's an incredibly difficult thing to be doing right now. Our argument would be that there are still spaces for the left to contest and win and build up bases of power. I think the Labour Party has a flawed and often rigged democracy, but it is an internal democracy nonetheless. And I think the left does have scope to be better organised, to mobilise more, to elect more left-wing delegates to Labour Party conference. This year the right wing had more delegates to Labour Party conference. That it wasn't a massive majority; it was a majority nonetheless. That's something we could flip next time round. We could have stronger, more disciplined left-wing caucuses in constituency Labour parties, which would help in terms of passing policy and holding like local MPs to account. But I think really crucially, the biggest opportunity for any wing of the party, but particularly the left, for building a base of power is in local government. There's lots of discussion during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the party about open selections, mandatory reselections for MPs. We already have that for councillors. There is a lot of scope for socialists within the party to be elected to local government. And there's a lot of Labour councils where just a few socialists being elected would at least be a significant minority of a Labour administration, will be able to exert leverage and make key demands, but even potentially run councils in a way that is as humane and socialist as possible. We've seen this in places like North Ayrshire and Preston, where alternative economic experiments and models have been pioneered with great success within very difficult and challenging contexts. And so I think, what we see is, I think the right wing of the Labour Party has been given free rein by Keir Starmer to run it organisationally, but there's only so much that they can control. And I think there are clear examples of socialists in local government basically being left to get on with it. And I think that will continue to be the case. And I think when we think about what are some of the preconditions for climate justice in this country, I think it's not the be all and end all, but I think a more democratic local politics is a really important precondition. It's about giving people more say over how we run our housing, how we run our transport, how we run our energy, for example. Having socialists and local government able to make those demands and implement those policies is really crucial. And that's something that we should continue to organise around.
So I'm going to move on to another question that I've got, which is on a completely different topic, but it would be interesting to get your thoughts on it. But in the meantime, please, if anyone does have questions, do stick them in the chat, and I'll try and stick them to Chris if we've got time. So, Chris, you've been very critical in the past of the international process for dealing with climate, and we're having
Mm.
this conversation today. As COP27 is taking place in Egypt, you've previously written about your deep criticisms of that process, and also your criticism of the climate movement for spending a significant amount of its energy trying to influence the COP process in the international kind of negotiations. So I wanted to get your sense of what you think of the current COP that's ongoing in Egypt. What, if any, outcomes you think we're going to get from that, and sort of re-articulate why you think that the COP as a moment is a distraction for the climate movement.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the caveat I'd say is I don't take a particularly hard line position that nobody in the climate movement should pay any attention to COP. I think clearly it's an institution that is very flawed, but it exists, and I think there's actually a parallel you can draw with the Labour Party, where you'd say, the Labour Party in the context of UK politics is deeply flawed. There's lots wrong with it, but it is what there is. You say the same with trade unions, often very flawed institutions, but they are the institutions of the working class in this country. The COP process is the kind of international institution that we have that exists for kind of international diplomacy around this, around climate mitigation and adaptation. And so I think it is right that some climate activists, especially internationally, coordinate to make interventions, to make demands, to extract concessions. I think that's right. I think the critique that you allude to that I've made in the past, I think still stands. I think those activists making those interventions need to have a really clear sense of what are the limitations. The same if you're organizing the Labour Party, you need to understand what the limitations of that are. The limitations of it, and for me, it is the UNFCCC COP is a process that has been constructed in the context of an international political economy that is hegemonized, that is dominated by the US, by the West, by capitalist countries. I think if you look at the process, the history of COP has been one of countries like the US bullying poorer countries who have made very reasonable demands about rapidity of decarbonisation, of finance and support, of the polluter pays principle. Whenever these justice-oriented demands have been made in that process, they've been sidelined. And I think sometimes the climate movement has, I think, a real problem with an impulse for like immediacy. I think it's really understandable that the climate issue, which is one that has a really clear like time-bound nature, impels in people a sense of urgency, a sense of wanting to do something, anything now. And I think we see that with a lot of the protests, whether it's just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion that we see recently. I think it's all about very quick, immediate, gratifying action. I think we see the same thing with COP. Every year it comes around in one form or another. It makes sense as a kind of big set piece event for the climate movement to target. But my view is that too much energy goes to that when actually more energy should be spent on a longer view of, well, how are we building power locally? How are we building up and demanding alternative structures? How are we building power such that we can eventually reorganize the international political economy so that these negotiations can happen in a structure where power is more equitably distributed, where it's not just about coming up with trade deals that benefit the US and the West under the guise of climate action. And yeah, I think too often we default into having a big march and saying, well, we support climate justice and this process has failed. I think as a climate movement, we need to take it upon ourselves to build power and demand an alternative. Sometimes that will involve making interventions at COP. More often than not, it will involve doing the hard work of working through our trade unions, working in our communities, working in our political parties as well.
Thank you so much, Chris. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for more questions, but it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you as always, and I'm sure Your contributions have triggered lots of thoughts and questions and responses from people, which I'm looking forward to seeing later on. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
So that was Chris Saltmarsh, who was the co-founder of Labour for a Green New Deal, and also the author of this book, Burnt: Fighting for Climate Justice, which you can get at all good book retailers. Uh, Probably. It's published by Pluto Press. It's a good read. There's lots of stuff I think your people will agree with, lots they'll disagree with, but it is nonetheless thought provoking and a brilliant read.